Hello and welcome to the next episode of my Learn With Me Hydrasynth series. This is episode 15, Effects Part 2. So the first question is, what is Learn With Me? Well, Learn With Me is a series where I demonstrate my process end to end of learning to get the best out of a synthesizer. In this case, the ASM Sound Machine's Hydrasynth Explorer. The Hydrasynth Explorer is an 8-voice digital synthesizer which is part of a family of 4 synthesizers, all of which have the same sound engine, albeit the one of them has 2 instances, and they all have a polyphonic aftertouch way of entering notes. In this case, it is a 37 mini key keyboard with poly aftertouch and note on and note off velocity. So far I've talked about my general impressions of the build quality, of the control paradigm, I've described the architecture end to end, and we've listened to some presets. Then I've gone into each one of the different sections, or modules as they call them, to try and get a feel for how they function. Last episode we looked at some of the effects, specifically the delay and reverb. Now we will look at what are called the pre and post effects. But first I'd like to make a general comment about how these effects are handled and something I'd like to change. Let me make an init patch here. So in the init patch, we can see the effect type is bypass on the pre-effect. The delay has 0% on the wet-dry mix. The reverb has 0 on the wet-dry mix. And there is bypass on the post-effect. So what does this say to us? Well, these are insert effects. In other words, all the voices are mixed. All that audio gets passed through each of the effects in turn before being output. This is a reasonable strategy. It's fairly simple, but it allows us slightly less flexibility than if we could control the routing of the audio through those effects. So, for example, the delay tails, the echoes, are always going to be fed to the reverb. So the echo is also going to have reverb applied, which we may or may not want. One of the other ways in which these could have been handled is the delay and the reverb could be treated as send effects. One of the things I would have liked about send effects is you could imagine a send level not for the entire signal, but on a per voice basis. This would allow me to, for example, map velocity of a note to send level to the reverb. So when I hit a note hard, a lot of reverb comes out. When I hit it lightly, a little reverb comes out. You may think, well, why not just use wet-dry mix? Well, firstly, even if I was playing monophonically, if I hit a note hard and the wet-dry mix goes high, and then I hit a note lightly and it goes low, it's not only going to affect the reverb of the latter note, but also the former notes. If I'm playing polyphonically, there is only one reverb on the synthesizer, so we cannot have a per voice adjustment. Only one of those voices is going to have an impact. So it would have been nice to see them configurable as sends, but this does work reasonably well, and with the complicated modulations available, I think it is more than adequate. So let's have a look at what effects are available. The pre and post effects sections have the same effects available, so I'm not going to go through both of them independently. We have chorus, flanger, rotary, phaser, lo-fi, tremolo, EQ, compressor, distortion. So let's just have a quick look at them in order. On the second page, we have this post effects parameter. This is what they call a template or a preset. So there are a number of presets that you can look at for the chorus, and specifically there are 3. By looking at the parameters, we have how much feedback is carried out on the chorus. Not all choruses feedback any signal, so feedback of 0 can make sense. The phase offset between the repeats, and whether this is a stereo or a mono effect, as in the different voices of the chorus, do they go to different pan positions or do they all remain in the center? The common parameters, so those are effectively specific to this effect, these are very similar across all the effects, would be the rate, and the rate is the rate of the movement of the chorus, and depth is the depth of the chorus in the way that you would probably expect. So let's listen. I think it'll be easy just to listen to something simple like that, but it's a little bit abrasive, so let me just shape it a Okay, I just shaped it a tiny little bit. Maybe I'll close the filter a fraction too. Okay. So, what I usually do with a chorus is I'll turn the depth high, find a rate I'm happy with, then I'll set the depth I'm happy with, and then I'll check these other parameters. So this is a phase offset. Could be interesting to modulate maybe. This is a feedback amount. So when you're feeding it back, you almost get a comb filter type of effect, which is quite interesting. So definitely a reasonable sounding chorus. And as I said, though it is not like a separate chorus pedal on which you have very fine-tuned adjustments or chorus on your computer, you can modulate these parameters to potentially interesting effects. Let's listen. Pure wet. Quite a nice sound. Let's move to flanger. So this has some presets as well, and those presets, let's see, they adjust all the parameters. So let's just try them out, except the wet dry, it seems. So the flanger, interestingly, reminds me a bit of the chorus with some feedback. Let's try preset 2. Preset 1. Those same sort of parameters, we have the phase offset, we have the amount of the output signal that gets fed back to the inputs. The rate goes up to 10 Hz, so remember the LFOs went up to 150, so you can't do audio rate flanging because it probably doesn't make that much sense. Interesting. I wish I had some velocity sensitivity. So here we go. Let's go back to the effect. Pretty pedestrian sort of flanger, nothing outstanding, but it does what you would expect it to do. And consider that we have both pre and post effects. We have 2 shots at adding character here. So imagine layering a pair of flangers with different parameters. I could imagine you could get pretty out there if you wanted. Next is rotary. So I'm guessing this is a rotary simulation. Let's try 100% wet. So that definitely sounds rotary. I see. So typically a rotary speaker has 2 speeds, a high speed and a low speed. So we can set the 2 speeds here. There's the wet-dry mix. And we can set, I think, the depth of the panning effect that we're hearing as this moves back and forth. And I guess this high-low parameter is adjusting how far from the high end to the low end we're hearing. So you could imagine maybe using an expression pedal to adjust that. You can also hear that the rotary colors the signal quite significantly. So it has some interest to it. I feel like it's good to have in your arsenal, but I'm not sure exactly when I'd be using it yet, but that's not to say that I wouldn't. Next we have phaser. So phaser is a close colleague of the flanger. Let's listen to the presets. So we can hear a sort of formanty vowel sound rather than a comb filter sound, and that's really the audible difference between the flanger and the phaser. Quite like the impact that the feedback has. I imagine it's quite difficult to tune it musically. but I think that is definitely a serviceable phaser. So when you're looking for those phasey sounds, then this is available to you. Possibly if you were playing monophonically, it might be interesting to use an envelope to modulate some of these parameters so you could get some interesting distortion and glitches. Let's keep moving. Lo-fi. So this is a lo-fi effect. Let's try 100% wet. So this is sample rate reduction. And then there is also a filter. I see, so simulating the sound through the radio, through a telephone, or a clean filter, or a low-pass filter. We have a volume boost, we have presets as before, and then we also have a filter which seems to get applied after that sample rate reduction is done. That's a filter. We can do a wet-dry blend, so let's try. Quite an interesting sound. I think maybe this radio filter is quite an extreme one. I guess I've got the resonance quite high, which is making it a bit more tonal. So I could imagine with some fine tuning that could add some interesting sort of grit and character. I feel like I'd especially like to use that on the pre-effect. So as that's being fed into the delay and reverb. But then you could use a second lo-fi on the post effect, maybe more subtle, to add a little bit more character to the reverb tail and to the delays. So let's continue. Tremolo. So you can set if there is any pitch modulation, you can adjust the phase of the tremolo, what shape the envelope is going to be, the rate and the depth. Let's listen. So we don't have a BPM sync here. I suppose that's not strictly necessary. Wet dry, so we can do this in parallel. Typically or often for these type of insert effects, they are all or nothing. So having the wet dry is an interesting addition. Let's see how that sounds. So a classic tremolo. Somehow I feel almost like I'd be inclined to modulate the amp envelope to get a tremolo effect, but I think this is serviceable. I'm not sure that I'm too enthused by it. Let's try the EQ. So EQ seems to be a 3-band EQ. We have a way of setting the crossover point for where the high band starts and where the low band starts when we have 3 gains. So let's put some high gain. Let's put some low gain. And some mid gain. This is interesting because we have wet dry, so we can pick this in some sort of more extreme form, and then we can dial it back with a wet dry. Surprisingly, I quite enjoy the way that that sounds. It reminds me a bit of just having my regular EQ on a mixer just to add some timbre shaping. So I could imagine, especially as a post effect, this could be quite useful. Next, we have a compressor. You have attack and release and output compensation. You can specify where the side chain is coming from, so it can be BPM synced ducking. So this is presumably going to mean that it can compress tempo synced. So if you were playing some sort of music that had a very regular, for example, kick drum, you could BPM sync it and then it would sound at the right moment. We have a classic ratio selection. We can set the threshold and the attack and release. So pretty conventional, but let's just listen to it. So let's try turning that way down. Very high compression, fully wet. So in this case, you can hear that extreme compression and the attack is really fast. So it drops and then it swells back up. That's the release. Obviously, this is not how you normally use a compressor, but you can hear the motion that's happening there. Let's compress it much less. Let's try adjusting the wet-dry blend. So this is letting us do parallel compression. Let's play. Interesting. I feel like it's not a refined enough compressor to want to use at the very end of the chain as a sort of classic compression like you use when tracking, but I can imagine it used as a special effect kind of compressor, maybe in the pre-effect slot, also in the post-effect, but not your normal mastering compressor, something a little bit more in your face, shall we say. Finally, distortion. This has wet-dry, so again, you have the capacity for parallel distortion. You can set asymmetry, I guess. So asymmetry usually means that the signal is centered around zero. Asymmetry will shift the signal one way or other. So as when the drive happens, there is a asymmetric distortion for positive and negative voltages, which will add more harmonics and an unusual character. I guess this is an output compensation because usually the drive is making things louder. The drive parameter is going to be how much is the signal amplified as part of this distortion process. I guess tone is adjusting whether we wanted a brighter or a darker distortion. So if you over distort it, it turns into a sort of very metallic sound there. So that is pretty seriously distorted. Let's try some parallel distortion. So let's play. Interesting sound. I'm tempted, not that I've done this for any of the rest of them, to run a sine wave through. So we can definitely hear that a lot of harmonics are being added by that. Let's go to the effect and turn it down. Turn it maximum. Almost like an electric guitar, right? And turn down a bit, it sounds a bit more like an organ. So I think this drive, you could use it on the post effect. It could add some interesting timbre. I could imagine it, for example, bringing out the tone of the late reverb tail and adding some crunch to that, which could be pretty interesting. Overall, There are a good complement of effects. To some extent, I wish there was more flexibility in the effects. They sound pretty good. It's a decent reverb, a decent delay, a decent complement of these pre and post effects. But if we could have had a little more routing flexibility, a little more flexibility to arbitrarily place these things. So imagine I could say that I wanted two delays and I wanted them to both be sends, but I wanted them to run at different tempos. I could get some interesting offbeat rhythms. I think that's maybe a trick that they missed, although this is already a fairly complicated synthesizer, and I think maybe that would push things a step too far. In any case, I think that brings us to the end of the signal flow and all of these modules. We have a couple of other things to look at in the voice section, the macro section, and maybe elsewhere. But I think I now have a pretty good picture of what to expect from this synthesizer. Once we get past those last two little sections to look at, we will be moving on to doing some sound design, which really uses and hopefully pushes this synthesizer. In any case, I do hope you've been enjoying the series. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you'll join me for some more episodes. But most importantly, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining me today, and goodbye.